What if everything you thought you knew about Spartan discipline left out its darkest law? We picture them as warriors obsessed with battle, but the agog included practices that forced intimacy on the young, binding them to their elders in ways meant to create absolute loyalty. Some historians defend it as tradition. Others see it as brutal control. The truth lies somewhere in between, and it's a chapter most history books skip. Was this loyalty building, or something far darker? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me the time you're watching. If you want more history no one else dares to touch, subscribing is your choice. You arrive in the world not as someone's precious little bundle, but as Sparta's newest draft pick, and the scouts are waiting. Imagine it. Your body is only hours old, yet stern men are already circling like picky judges at a dog show. They check your chest limbs, even your face. Are you sturdy enough, symmetrical enough, Spartan enough? If yes, congratulations, you get to live. If not, well, the cliff at Mount Tegetus becomes your first and final cradle. Brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. The hook here is simple, and Sparta love doesn't choose who survives, law does. From this first breath, you belong less to your mother's arms than to the collective will of the state. That milk you drink, it's a temporary loan before the agog swallows you whole. Even as a baby, every giggle, every cry is weighed against the needs of a society obsessed with strength. Picture a modern hospital where newborns are evaluated like applicants for a sports team, not for cute Instagram photos, but for military readiness. It sounds dystopian, but for Spartans, it was Tuesday. Your parents don't debate bedtime stories or which school you'll attend. Instead, your fate hinges on whether the elders approve your body. The father, rather than hugging his infant, might hold him out like a piece of livestock waiting for the elder's nod. And if the nod doesn't come, the baby isn't given back. Imagine the weight of that moment, your own bloodline controlled by public decree. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was efficiency, pruning the tree early so the state never had to waste resources on branches deemed too weak to carry fruit. The funny thing, Sparta prided itself on being a society that loved discipline more than affection. Babies elsewhere in Greece could grow into poets, merchants, or philosophers. But here you were a seed meant only to sprout into soldier. You're not nurtured for individuality. You're cultivated for conformity. And even mothers who endured 9 months carrying you had to swallow the idea that you weren't truly theirs. You were Sparta's property. That's a twisted kind of daycare, isn't it? Think of Lycurgus the lawgiver. He supposedly designed these customs to forge a city immune to weakness, a place where every citizen was sharp-edged like a sword. Whether he was a real person or part myth doesn't even matter. His shadow loomed over every cradle. You, a mewling infant, don't know his name, but your bones are already bending under his laws. He's like a CEO you'll never meet, but every paycheck, every coffee break, every sigh at your desk is ultimately his design. The pressure didn't stop with survival. Even if you passed inspection, your upbringing was molded to match the same ruthless standard. Nurses could swaddle you loosely to toughen your muscles, deny you comfort when you cried, or plunge you into cold water so your body learned to fight chill instead of blankets. Picture your average toddler tumbling around in a playground. Now replace the slide and sandbox with icy baths, coarse cloth, and deliberate neglect. Not because the adults hated you, but because they believed this forged resilience. Love, if it existed, was a luxury hidden under layers of state necessity. Do you wonder what it did to Spartan parents? Imagine the silence of a mother told her baby failed inspection. In Athens, grief might be softened with rituals, songs, or poetry. In Sparta, grief was swallowed whole, spat out as pride. Better the city loses one than raises the weak. It's like the world's harshest parenting manual. Don't bond too much. Don't coddle. Don't even assume tomorrow will come, unless the elders say so. And when you survived, the reward wasn't freedom, but deeper obligation. You grew up knowing you'd been chosen. The cliff rejected others, but you remained proof of strength, or maybe just luck. That knowledge, whether you understood it consciously or not, became a leash. You were constantly reminded that your body was state property, polished and tested like bronze armor. Even your survival was a debt to Sparta, a debt you would pay back in sweat obedience and battles. The oddest part: this system worked for what Sparta wanted. For centuries, this tiny city held its ground against enemies far larger. But the cost was staggering. Individuals erased, families broken, and affection smothered under law. When you lie awake, imagining your earliest years, the lesson isn't lullabies, but survival. The state doesn't just teach you how to live, it decides if you deserve to. By the time you reach 7 years old, your life changes so abruptly it feels like a kidnapping, except your parents don't resist, they hand you over. Childhood in Sparta doesn't belong to you or your family. It belongs to the agoge, the state's iron-fisted school. Imagine a camp where every rule is designed not to protect children, but to break them down and rebuild them into weapons. That's where you march bare feet, slapping against the dirt, head-shaved, eyes wide as older boys smirk at the fresh recruits. The agoge isn't about reading Homer under olive trees or learning how to charm crowds like an Athenian orator. Here, your curriculum is pain, hunger, and silence. The first lesson: obedience. You're taught to keep your eyes lowered when elders speak, not because respect feels natural, but because hesitation brings punishment. Teachers don't coddle, they whip. The lash isn't a deterrent. It's a teaching tool as common as chalk in a modern classroom. Can you picture today's PTA meeting if parents were told their kids would be publicly flogged for mumbling? Meals are small deliberately so. Hunger is baked into the syllabus. You receive just enough to survive, but never enough to feel full. The reasoning is simple. Constant hunger makes you resourceful. If you want more, you must steal. But here's the cruel twist: you're punished not for stealing, but for getting caught. Picture that the state practically encourages you to sneak food, then savages you if you slip up. It's a masterclass in doublethink, grooming you to outwit everyone while staying perpetually on edge. And don't imagine a scolding. Getting caught could mean a whipping so fierce your back resembles plowed soil. At night, you don't return to the comfort of your family home. You curl up in barracks, packed shoulder to shoulder, with boys just as hungry, just as nervous, just as hardened. Privacy is gone. Whispering secrets, swapping jokes, even scratching your nose is noticed. In this crowded hall, every movement is monitored, every weakness exposed. You might think of a modern dormitory, but replace the RA with a soldier who beats you for snoring too loud. And oh, the tests. They come constantly. Run barefoot across rocky fields until your soul's split. Endure beatings without crying out. Wrestle, bite, claw, do whatever it takes to prove you won't fold. Pain becomes as ordinary as breathing. At first you might flinch, but soon you learn to mask it. Your body trembles. Your eyes water, but your jaw clenches. Crying is weakness, and weakness is shame. Imagine a society where even a child's tears are outlawed. How different would our world look if playgrounds echoed only with silence? The strangest part might be the surveillance. Older boys, already shaped by the system, serve as overseers. They spy, they report, they enforce. They're not much older than you, but already they wield power like miniature tyrants. If you think school bullies today are bad, imagine them backed by law, encouraged to watch you fail, rewarded for cruelty. There's no safe corner in the agogsh, no refuge. Every peer could be both comrade and snitch. Yet in a warped way, bonds do form. Suffering together forges a solidarity ordinary childhood friendships rarely touch. The boy next to you, who shared a crust of stolen bread, who shielded you when lashes fell too hard, that's a bond born of fire. Some historians argue this was part of the plan too. Unity mattered. Spartans had to trust one another in the phalanx shoulder pressed to shield no gaps allowed. What better way to ensure unbreakable loyalty than shared pain from the age of 7? Think for a moment, would you survive this system? Would hunger sharpen you or hollow you? Would the lashes make you harder or break you? The Agog didn't care about individuality. It churned boys into soldiers like a factory producing identical spears. You weren't supposed to shine only to hold the line. Excellence wasn't brilliance. It was endurance. By the time you're a teenager, you hardly remember your parents' touch. Home is a ghost. The barracks, the drills, the punishments, these are your reality. You walk taller, thinner scarred, but with eyes that already calculate survival in every room. Childhood, as the rest of Greece knew it, Song's family mischief never belonged to you. The Agogi owned you, and as you trudge across the dusty training field, stomach growling, skin welted, you know you've been reshaped into something less human and more Spartan. By the time your voice cracks and your shoulders begin to broaden, the Agog throws you into yet another arrangement that feels less like choice and more like conscription of the heart. The law pairs you with an older Spartan, a mentor figure, though mentor sounds far too cozy for what's actually happening. In Athens, a mentor might teach you philosophy or poetry. Here in Sparta, he shapes your body, your will, and awkwardly, your intimacy. The state requires this bond, not for love, not for kindness, but because it believes such connections make you sharper, fiercer, more loyal to the brotherhood of warriors. Picture it, you're 15, still half boy, half man, and suddenly an older Spartan singles you out. Maybe he's respected, scarred from battle, his presence heavy as bronze. Maybe he terrifies you. Either way, the choice isn't yours. Society expects him to mold you and expects you to yield. Does it matter what you feel? Not really. Feelings aren't part of the curriculum here. If this sounds confusing, that's because it is. The law doesn't leave room for consent in the modern sense. It leaves only duty. What's interesting is how the Spartans dressed this up as noble. Philosophers later claimed these pairings encouraged courage and discipline, as if an older warrior's watchful eye could make you braver on the battlefield. They framed it as a path to manhood, almost like a rough apprenticeship, but with far more pressure. Imagine if today's internships required not just shadowing your boss, but living in his shadow body and mind. You're not interning for Starbucks here. You're interning for survival. You might ask, was there affection? Sometimes, maybe. Some pairs grew close, finding warmth in the icy barracks. Others endured it coldly like chores. What mattered was not love, but the bond's outcome. Were you tougher, braver, more obedient? Think of it like a fitness trainer who isn't interested in your personal goals, only in whether you can bench press more for the team's glory. The relationship isn't about you, it's about Sparta. Of course, this system came with tension. Not every boy wanted to be chosen, not every man wanted to choose. Yet pressure carved our choice. Refusal wasn't exactly encouraged. It branded you strange, even suspicious. To the Spartan mind, dodging the bond meant dodging your duty. And in a society where conformity was prized above all suspicion, was a dangerous label to carry. Now imagine how this shapes your sense of self. Your body isn't just yours, it's under constant review. Your loyalty isn't just to your peers, but tethered to one older figure whose approval, whose training, even whose presence dominates your teenage years. Your nights in the barracks blur into long days of running drills. And there he is, always watching, correcting, sometimes praising more, often demanding. If you slip, the lash follows. If you excel, the credit belongs as much to him as to you. The irony. While outsiders whispered scandal about Spartan practices within Sparta, this was normalized, even idealized. The bond was described in lofty terms, wrapped in talk of virtue and courage. Historians like Plutarch later painted it as almost spiritual, a union of souls striving together. But when you live inside it, it's less poetry, more pressure cooker. The law doesn't allow space for your personal compass. Whether you feel admiration, fear, resentment, or nothing at all doesn't matter. The state has decided that this arrangement is good for you. And in Sparta, what's good for the state is law. And yet the strange part is these bonds sometimes did what they were meant to do, forge terrifying warriors, fighting alongside someone you're bound to, someone whose approval you crave, or whose wrath you fear can indeed push you harder than fighting alone. Shoulder to shoulder, in the phalanx you don't want to falter, not in front of your comrades, and certainly not in front of him. Would you thrive under such scrutiny, or would you wither crushed by the weight of being molded by another man's expectations? The truth is, no one cared what answer you whispered to yourself in the dark. The only answer Sparta wanted was shown in battle scars and silence under the whip. And so you march forward another link in a chain, forged not by affection, but by law, wondering whether you belong to yourself at all. You think you've adjusted to the rules, the hunger, the mentor watching your every move. Then comes the cruelest revelation. Even sleep isn't yours. The barracks aren't just where you rest. They're where your individuality dissolves. Privacy doesn't exist here. And if you've ever complained about a college roommate stealing your snacks, imagine dozens of bodies crammed together, every cough, snore, and shuffle magnified in the darkness. This isn't home. This is a factory line where boys become soldiers. Wooden floors creak under the constant traffic of bare feet. The air hangs thick with sweat smoke from the hearth and the faint tang of unwashed tunics. You lie down, shoulder to shoulder, your blanket more symbolic than warm, and the night is far from peaceful. Someone whispers, someone shifts, someone gets cuffed for speaking too loudly. Even the silence feels staged, like the whole room is holding its breath to prove endurance. You start to wonder, when did sleep turn into another drill? You might chuckle at the thought of today's sleep apps, measuring your REM cycles with soothing ocean sounds. Here, your sleep data would be, did you twitch when bitten by lice? Did you whimper when cramps knotted your stomach? Did you wake when the whip cracked to silence an insubordinate boy? That's the Spartan version of bedtime analytics. And yet, in this crucible, bonds form strange, reluctant, but unbreakable. You share hunger bruises, fear of the next day's trial. It's kind of closeness that erases normal boundaries. Arms, brush shoulders, lean warmth is stolen rather than shared. The line between friendship dependence and duty blurs. You're not allowed to call it love. You're not even encouraged to name it camaraderie. It's just survival, a forced intimacy written into law by proximity. Think about this. When was the last time you were crammed into a space where you couldn't turn without touching someone? Maybe a packed subway car at rush hour, bodies pressed against you, breath mingling with strangers. Now imagine living like that every night for years, with no exit button, no polite, "excuse me." That's your reality, and it reprograms your sense of comfort forever. The elders insisted this arrangement toughened you, broke selfishness, forged unity. And in some ways, they were right. When you fight in a phalanx shield to shield, knowing the man beside you has shared your lice and your nightmares, hesitation disappears. But what gets lost in the process? A sense of self, a sense of private thought. Even your dreams are infiltrated by the collective, because when you wake, you do so as one body dozens of hearts pounding toward the same rhythm. Some accounts whisper of boys who rebelled quietly, an extra breath of laughter, a whispered joke about an overseer. But rebellion here isn't rebellion as we know it. It's fleeting, a spark quickly snuffed. Imagine telling a joke at school only to be whipped bloody for the punchline. How long before humor becomes dangerous, even to yourself? Still, not everything in the barracks was cruelty. There were moments, small, fragile, where kindness slipped through. An older boy sliding his crust of bread toward you. Someone shielding you during inspection. These flickers of humanity are what you cling to, though you never speak of them. Naming them might make them vanish. This is what makes Spartan nights so haunting. They're not nights of rest or even of dreams. They're nights of negotiation between hunger and exhaustion, between fear and trust, between the warmth of bodies and the cold demands of the state. You learn that survival isn't just about enduring lashes or running barefoot over thorns. It's about mastering the art of closeness without ever calling it closeness. And as you rise at dawn, shaking straw from your tunic, rubbing grit from your eyes, you realize you've become something different. Less a boy, not yet a man, but certainly no longer your own. You're a thread in a tightly woven fabric stitched by the law, and tearing free isn't an option. By the time you've hardened into adulthood, the state unveils another decree: marriage. Not marriage, as you might picture it, romance flowers, shared dreams, but marriage as civic paperwork, stamped and filed by Sparta's invisible clerks. Your wife isn't someone you wooed, not a partner chosen through affection or chemistry. She's assigned like a chore, as though the state is saying, "Congratulations, you've advanced to the next stage in our human resources program." You meet her not in candlelit intimacy, but through ritualized arrangements. Sometimes families coordinate, sometimes officials step in, but in every case, love has nothing to do with it. You are not asked whether you find her charming, witty, or beautiful. What matters is whether the match looks promising for the production of strong children. The phrase "marrying for love" would make a Spartan laugh the way we laugh at the idea of paying taxes voluntarily. It simply isn't in the cultural script. It's worth pausing here. In Athens, men might pursue courtesans, spend hours at symposia, or pen poetry dripping with desire. In Sparta, you trudge through the motions, your wedding less a personal milestone and more a line item in the state's fertility ledger. Imagine being told your spouse was selected not because she completes you, but because she complements Sparta. That's the level of romance you're allowed. The wedding itself doesn't soften things. Instead of a joyful celebration, the ceremony is stripped down practical, even unsettling. Your bride is sometimes seized, her head shaved, her body clothed in men's garments before she's brought to you. This strange disguise supposedly eases the transition for a young groom more familiar with barracks than with women. Can you picture a modern bride shaved bald and dressed in men's clothes, her first night orchestrated like a state ceremony? It's not the stuff of romantic comedies, that's for sure. Your duty is clear: produce children, sons ideally. Daughters are tolerated, but less celebrated. There's pressure here, not whispered, but shouted in every glance from the elders. A barren marriage isn't a private sorrow, it's a public failure. Men who don't produce heirs risk ridicule, fines, even disenfranchisement. Your intimacy is judged not by tenderness, but by output. If you could file quarterly fertility reports to the state, you would. How does this affect your view of your wife? She isn't just partner or companion. She's a fellow cog, her womb, an extension of Sparta's army factory. That doesn't mean there was no affection at all. Some couples surely grew close over time. But affection here was incidental, never the goal. Think of a modern office arranged marriage. You and your coworker are assigned to run a project together. Maybe you get along, maybe you don't. But the project must succeed regardless. That's how marriage feels in Sparta, except the project is the next generation. Interestingly, Spartan women weren't the docile brides common elsewhere in Greece. They trained, physically learned to manage estates, and wielded unusual independence compared to Athenian women. Yet this strength didn't make marriage any less transactional. Your bride might match your stamina, but she still arrives in your life not as your chosen equal, but as the state's appointment. You don't daydream about her smile. You calculate whether she'll bear sturdy sons. Picture yourself now standing in a dimly lit room, staring at a woman you barely know. Both of you, caught in a web of expectations you didn't spin. There's no soft conversation about dreams or laughter spilling into the night. There's only duty, obligation, the invisible hand of Lycurgus reminding you that even your bed is Sparta's business. And you begin to realize something chilling. The law has marched you from birth inspection to agage training to marriage, and at no point have you been asked what you wanted. If you thought the wedding ceremony was odd, wait until you hear about consummation. This isn't the tender night celebrated in modern stories with candles, music, and awkward laughter. No Sparta prefers theater. The ritual begins with your bride, disguised like a boy, hair cropped, dressed in a man's cloak, stripped of softness. Why? Because you've spent your formative years shoulder to shoulder with men in the barracks. The state, in its peculiar logic, thinks easing you toward a wife means making her resemble the only bodies you've known so far. Romance, Spartan style, is built on trickery. The strangeness doesn't stop there. The consummation happens in secrecy, almost as if marriage is something shameful rather than celebrated. You don't take her home and begin life together. You sneak to her, often at night, like a burglar breaking into your own house. Imagine explaining that to a modern couple. Yes, you're married, but you can only visit your spouse in secret, preferably disguised, and for heaven's sake, don't get caught. This isn't a honeymoon, it's a spy mission. The purpose behind all this, though, is deadly serious. The elders believed secrecy made your longing stronger, your connection sharper. Denial, they thought, sharpened desire the way hunger sharpens appetite. If you live apart, slipping to your wife's side only occasionally, then every encounter feels urgent, less about affection than about ensuring fertility. It's intimacy managed like a state ration, not too much, not too little, just enough to produce the next Spartan citizen. Consider the atmosphere of that first night. The air tense, the ritual awkward. You drilled to obedience now face the strangest command of all. Fulfill your civic duty, not on the battlefield, but in a dimly lit room with someone you hardly know. She shaved and cloaked, becomes less a partner and more a vessel of the law. There is no audience, no applause, but the pressure is louder than any crowd. It's almost comical to compare this with the modern idea of wedding night jitters. Couples today worry about spilled champagne or in-laws overstaying their welcome. In Sparta, your jitters revolve around whether you'll perform your role under the crushing gaze of cultural expectation. Failure isn't personal. It's public, a sign that you've let down the very machine that raised you. Imagine fumbling your way through knowing whispers might circulate about your inadequacy, endangering not just your pride, but your standing as a citizen. This ritual exposes Sparta's logic in its rawest form. Marriage is not about two people weaving lives together. It's a factory test, a state-approved procedure. Even the staging, the shaved hair, the secrecy reminds you that personal comfort is irrelevant. What matters is the outcome, new Spartans. You can almost picture a bureaucrat stamping a parchment consummation successful, proceed to offspring production. And yet some couples must have found ways to twist these rules into something resembling warmth. Maybe stolen moments turned tender. Maybe ritual transformed into routine. Maybe routine bloomed into something like love. Humans, after all, can grow affection in the harshest soil, but the law didn't care. Whether you found joy or dread, the requirement remained. So you keep sneaking into the night, heart-pounding steps, quiet on the dirt path, hoping not to be noticed. It's absurd. You can shout in battle, but you must whisper to your own wife. And every time you slip away from the barracks, you carry the weight of the same thought. You're not here because of desire, not here because of choice. You're here because law commands it. You've probably heard wedding nights described as beginnings of love stories. Yet in Sparta, the story reads more like a contract signed in bloodless ink. The woman waiting for you isn't cherished for her smile or wit. She's prized for her hips, her muscles, her ability to give the state more warriors. Spartan women, unlike their Athenian sisters, were raised to be strong, outspoken, even competitive. They ran races, hurled javelins, and built bodies not for beauty, but for resilience. To outsiders, it looked like liberation. To you inside the system, it felt like calculation. From the day she was born, her life bent toward reproduction, just as yours bent toward war. Midwives and mothers examined her for sturdiness, not charm. Childhood games weren't weaving or poetry, but physical drills training her body like a fertile field ready for planting. By the time she meets you, she is both independent and confined, capable of managing estates, inheriting land, and speaking her mind, yet still shackled by the single expectation: produce strong sons. If she gives birth to girls, the state frowns not because daughters were useless, but because warriors were the only true currency Sparta valued. Imagine for a moment how this plays out in your daily life. Your wife commands the household, oversees helot laborers, and can even discipline them herself. She is no shrinking violet. In fact, she might scold you if she senses weakness. while men spend their lives in barracks, or battle women become the backbone of domestic control. Yet every praise for her strength loops back to her womb. It doesn't matter how sharp her tongue or quick her mind. What matters is how many citizens she can deliver into Sparta's ranks. It's a strange paradox. Spartan women enjoy freedoms. Their peers in Athens would envy owning property, exercising publicly, even mocking men in festivals if they underperformed. And yet those freedoms are granted not for their individuality, but because the state wants them in peak condition for childbearing. Think of a modern corporation that offers gym memberships and leadership workshops, but only because healthier employees produce better profit. That's the logic. Empower her, but only as long as her power feeds the machine. Some women resisted, or at least mocked the arrangement. Ancient writers tell of Spartan wives joking about cowardly men, shaming them into bravery. In a culture where everything tied back to reproduction and war, even humor was weaponized. Could you imagine your spouse leaning over the dinner table to sneer, "Come back with your shield," or "Don't come back at all"? For a Spartan, that wasn't hyperbole, it was daily expectation. Consider the infamous story of Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas. When asked by a foreign woman why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, she replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to men." It's a sharp line, celebrated for wit, but also chilling when you think about the weight it carries. To be valued because you manufacture warriors, what kind of pride is that? And what kind of trap? You lie beside your wife in those rare moments together, knowing she is as much an instrument of the state as you are. She might share your strength, even your frustrations, but she cannot escape her assigned role any more than you can escape yours. The barracks still call you back. The whispers of elders still weigh on your marriage, and the law still dictates your most private acts. Even in her independence, she is bound. Even in your duty, you are shackled. And between you, the only thread the state truly cares about is the cry of an infant strong enough to pass the next inspection. You'd think marriage would finally grant you freedom from the barracks, a bed to call your own, and nights of peace with your wife. But Sparta doesn't work that way. Even as a married man, your true home remains the communal barracks. Your wife. She waits for you in secrecy, your meetings carried out like covert operations. It's absurd when you think about it, sneaking into your own marriage like a thief, tiptoeing through shadows just to spend a night in the bed that technically belongs to you. Picture the scene: you slip out of the barracks, heartbeat thudding louder than your sandals against the dirt. The moonlight isn't romantic. It's your only lantern on a mission that feels more like espionage than love. You arrive at her house not as a husband walking proudly through the door, but as a shadow slipping through, praying no one sees. There's no stroll in public, no couples chatter on the streets. The marriage remains hidden, as though affection is something scandalous. Why all the secrecy? The Spartans believed constant separation kept desire strong, that longing sharpened the bond. If you rarely see your wife, the argument went, every meeting burns hotter urgency, outweighing comfort. In reality, it meant the state got to keep you tied to the barracks, always prioritizing brotherhood and battle readiness over domestic life. Love, family, even fatherhood, those were secondary hobbies at best. Your loyalty belonged first to your comrades, not your kin. Think about it. When was the last time you heard of a culture where men spent more nights with soldiers than with their own spouses? Maybe the closest parallel is modern military deployments. but at least those come with leave. In Sparta, there was no leave. The barracks claimed you until you were 60 years old. 60. Your wife had to get used to stolen moments, half-whispered conversations children conceived between curfew violations. Imagine being married for decades, but never sharing a roof except in secrecy. This bizarre arrangement shaped how Spartan families functioned. Children grew up less with fathers and more with mothers in the state. Boys were whisked away to the agog by age 7 girls raised to be strong and capable, but still tethered to their reproductive roles. Husbands drifted in and out like ghost reminders that intimacy existed, but fleeting fragile always interrupted. If family is a hearth, Sparta kept that hearth burning with embers instead of flame. And yet, in a strange way, this secrecy added intensity. Couples who managed to bond did so against the odds, snatching love where the state only demanded duty. Imagine sneaking down a dark corridor, heart pounding not out of rebellion, but out of longing. Some couples must have cherished those stolen hours, more than others cherished entire lives together. When everything is rationed, food privacy, affection, even the smallest taste feels overwhelming. Still, it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity. You're a full-grown man trained for war, hardened by lashes and hunger, yet reduced to sneaking into your wife's home like a teenager dodging curfew. You can face a Persian phalanx, but heaven forbid you be caught spending an extra hour with your spouse. The law has crafted you into a soldier who can conquer cities but not claim his own household. So you keep walking that tightrope, balancing secrecy with duty, affection, with law. Every night you slip into her arms, it feels like trespassing in your own life. Every dawn you return to the barracks, it feels like surrender. And slowly, the realization settles in, you may have a wife, children, even a household, but you never truly have a home. You've endured the inspections at birth, the lashings in the agoge, the secrecy of marriage. But here's the cruel edge of Spartan law. It isn't enough to follow the rules, you must succeed in them. If you falter, if you fail to measure up, the shame cuts deeper than any whip. In Sparta, disgrace is a punishment all its own, and the city has 1,000 ways to brand you as less than a man. Take intimacy, for example. If you can't fulfill your duty to father children, whispers coil around you like snakes. A barren marriage isn't private, it's public humiliation. The elders don't shrug and say, maybe it wasn't meant to be. No, they question your usefulness, your virility, your loyalty to the state. A man without children is a broken cog in Sparta's machine. The fines come next, the ridicule, and sometimes even loss of citizenship. Imagine a tax penalty, not for unpaid income, but for unpaid visits to your wife's womb. And if you resist the bonds imposed on you, refuse a mentor, reject a wife, or shirk the barracks, the city brands you trembler, coward, deviant. The shame alone is enough to ruin you. Spartans were masters of mockery, wielding laughter like a blade. At festivals, women might hurl insults at men who lagged behind their duties, jeering their failures in public. Picture an entire community joining in your name, echoing as a punchline. No courtroom trial, no appeal, just ridicule sharpened to law. Even age offered no escape. Men who remained unmarried, past a certain point, were dragged into public ceremonies where maidens circled and taunted them with songs. These weren't playful jokes, but deliberate state-approved humiliation. Look at the man who refused his duty, the songs implied. In a world obsessed with order, Being outside the pattern wasn't eccentric, it was intolerable. Think of modern parallels. Maybe a family reunion where every aunt asks why you're still single, or a workplace where colleagues gossip about your personal life. Now magnify that by 10,000 with the full force of law culture and religion pressing down. That's Sparta. You weren't just failing yourself. You were failing an entire system that had invested in you since birth, and failure in war unthinkable. If you dropped your shield in battle, you disgraced not only yourself, but your whole family. The saying wasn't "come home safe." It was, "come back with your shield, or on it." Mothers supposedly handed shields to their sons with those words demanding victory or death. What if you returned alive, but dishonored? You'd rather not imagine it. Cowards lost their civic rights, forced to wear half-shaven beards, forced to stand aside in lines, forced to absorb mockery until they became walking warnings. Sparta's laws carved shame as a sharper tool than execution. Death was quick, but disgrace lingered gnawing every hour. You learned to fear laughter, more than the lash whispers, more than spears. A soldier's skin could scar and heal, but reputation once cracked never mended. That's how the state kept you compliant, not just through violence, but through the terror of being an outcast in a society with no space for outcasts. It makes you wonder, would you have survived? Could you have carried the weight of such relentless scrutiny, knowing every step, every failure, every private act might be exposed, judged, and mocked? Or would you have stumbled once, then lived the rest of your days branded as less than a Spartan, your shame rehearsed in song at every festival? The law doesn't let you choose. In Sparta, honor is mandatory. And now, the truth crashes down with the weight of a shield wall. Everything you've endured, birth inspections, hunger drills, secret marriages, whispered duties, was never about love, never even about you. It was always about Sparta's survival, a legacy carved into your skin by law and ritual. The city that demanded your life from the moment you first cried wasn't interested in tenderness. It wanted soldiers, sons, and obedience. Your story is less romance and more machinery, gears grinding until they break. Look at the pieces. You weren't cradled as a child, you were measured. You weren't raised for dreams, you were starved into discipline. Your closest bonds weren't chosen friendships or romances, they were assigned, enforced, inspected. Even your marriage wasn't truly yours. The law disguised your wife, hid her in shadows, parceled out your nights together, as if rationing bread. At every turn, the private became public property. Your body wasn't yours. Your family wasn't yours. Not even your shame was yours. It all belonged to the state. And yet this merciless system created something the world couldn't ignore. A city of warriors feared across Greece, men who stood at Thermopylae against overwhelming odds, who became legends not because of tenderness, but because of law-forged endurance. When people speak of Spartan discipline today, they speak with awe, as if brutality were brilliance, as if the cost paid in love and humanity was a bargain well struck. But was it? That's the uncomfortable question Sparta leaves behind. Imagine living 60 years under this code, never shaking free of its grip. Even when you grew old, you were judged. Did you father enough children? Did you die with honor? Did you avoid disgrace? Your life is measured not by joy, but by output. By the time you collapse into the earth, what do you leave behind? Sons to fight, daughters to bear sons, and a name, hopefully, unsullied by shame. That is your epitaph. Think about how different this is from what we value today. We celebrate individuality, romance, personal happiness. We tell ourselves love stories where people choose, where affection is cherished, where private life belongs to us alone. Sparta laughs at that. For them, love was irrelevant. Privacy was indulgence, and happiness was weakness. The only thing that mattered was survival through strength. And survival, in their eyes, demanded sacrifice, not just of comfort, but of the most intimate human bonds. There's a strange irony here. Centuries later, people still marvel at Spartan toughness, using the word Spartan as a badge of honor. We forget that behind the glory was a system that starved its children, shaved its brides, mocked its failures, and rationed its affections. We admire the product without remembering the human cost. It's like praising a gleaming sword without considering the ore ripped from the mountain, the sweat of the smith, the fires that scorched it into shape. So as you lie down, imagining yourself in those long, crowded barracks, think of what it meant to live in a world where law reached into every breath. Think of what it cost to become the warrior everyone admired, but no one envied. And ask yourself, would you trade love for law, privacy for strength, tenderness for survival? Or would you, if given the chance, have slipped away from the barracks one night and never returned, carrying with you not just your shield, but the possibility of being human again? From the cradle to the barracks, Spartan life was never about love, but about survival, law, and obedience. Even marriage and intimacy served only the state's hunger for soldiers. Yet beneath this system's iron discipline lay an even darker truth, the fate of infants themselves. Now we step into the chilling world of Spartan infanticide. You arrive in Sparta, not as a tourist, but as a newborn. And the first thing you realize, if a baby could realize anything, is that your life is not in your family's hands. Forget the cozy modern image of a doctor holding you up to bright lights while everyone claps. Here, a panel of grim-faced elders waits like a panel of talent show judges, only the prize isn't fame, it's survival. You squeal, you twitch, maybe you even sneeze, and every little movement is judged with the gravity of state law. One elder squints at your limbs, another checks if you're breathing strong. If your skin looks too pale, if your head seems oddly shaped, if you're too small, you may as well have just failed the most terrifying audition in history. Plutarch, writing centuries later, described how Spartan elders carried out this inspection in the so-called lesh, a public building, not a private nursery. The idea was simple. A child belongs to the city before it belongs to the parents. Think about that for a second. You tiny and wriggling are declared either fit for Sparta or not worth raising. There's no warm family debate, no chance for a parent to say, "We'll love them anyway." The state's verdict is final. Do you ever wonder how today's helicopter parents fussing about organic baby food and stroller brands would react if their local council voted on their child's right to exist? This harsh procedure was not done out of malice, at least not in the way we imagine cruelty. The Spartans believed they were doing something practical, something logical. Weak children, they argued, would only burden society. A warrior culture could not afford mouths that couldn't fight bodies that couldn't endure, or illnesses that drained precious resources. Harsh? Absolutely. But in their eyes, merciful in the long run. Better to end life at the beginning than watch someone suffer through years of pain or uselessness. It's grim mathematics, the kind that only makes sense when survival, not comfort, is the currency. Imagine the parents. The mother who had endured childbirth without modern medicine, who perhaps had whispered to the baby in the dark hours before dawn, might find her arms empty again before she could even name the child. The father, trained since youth in the agoge and sworn to put Sparta before self, might not even flinch. He had been conditioned to see his newborn not as flesh of his flesh, but as a piece of the collective machine. Aristotle himself commented on this, noting that Sparta's population policies were starkly different from other Greek states. In Athens, even a sickly child might be kept hidden, raised with quiet hope. In Sparta, hope bowed to the needs of the phalanx. It's tempting to judge them from the comfort of a world with incubators, antibiotics, and therapy sessions. Today, a premature baby weighing barely a kilogram can grow up to be an Olympic athlete. Back then, a child with even a slight chance of frailty was branded unfit. The cruelty lay not just in the decision, but in how normal it became. No one in Sparta thought the process barbaric. It was civic duty, like paying taxes or taking out the trash. You didn't resist, because resisting meant standing against the entire Spartan worldview. And who would dare? The ceremony of judgment carried symbolism too. Elders represented not just experience, but the state's authority, as if saying your private emotions don't matter here. Love does not outweigh duty. It makes you wonder how many fathers stared just a little too long at their rejected child before hardening their jaw. How many mothers bit their lips until blood came, knowing a scream would change nothing? We'll never know, because Spartan sources do not preserve those tears. The records only tell us what happened, not how it felt. Yet silence often speaks louder than words. Even stranger, this system was admired by some later writers. Xenophon, for example, praised Spartan laws for producing the most disciplined, resilient soldiers in Greece. To him, the ends justified the means. If pruning the human tree early created a stronger forest, then the sacrifice was worth it. That logic might make sense in a textbook, but when you picture an elder nodding coldly while a baby squirms helplessly, it feels different, doesn't it? You can almost hear the uncomfortable coughs if such a policy were proposed in a city council meeting today. And so, in Sparta, the beginning of life was also the first test. You were not guaranteed the chance to cry for long. You had to be deemed worthy, strong enough to one day hold a shield march in step and die for the state if called. That was the dark truth. Survival was never about love, never about the family's will. It was about the city's cold calculation. Now that the verdict has been given, imagine what comes next. If you passed, you were handed back to your mother, destined for milk and lullabies, at least until the state came for you later. But if you failed, your path led to the apotheke, the infamous deposit place. The name sounds almost bureaucratic, like a storage room, but in truth, it was a rocky chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. It wasn't a cradle. It was a grave, disguised as sick order. Plutarch describes this pit as the final destination for infants judged unworthy. Picture the scene: a small bundle carried in the arms of a grim elder, the sound of sandals crunching against stone, the looming cliff casting shadows even at midday. For the Spartan citizens, this wasn't murder in the way we define it. It was more like returning something defective to the earth. Nature rejects them, they might say, as if shrugging away the weight of choice. Isn't it chilling how a simple phrase can sanitize a tragedy, you might ask? Was every rejected child truly tossed into this ravine? Some historians doubt it. Archaeology hasn't turned up thousands of tiny bones at Mount Taygetus, and the sheer logistics raise questions. Were some infants abandoned elsewhere, exposed in less dramatic places, perhaps even rescued by helots or passing strangers? It's possible. But the symbolism of the apothete mattered more than the statistics. The pit wasn't just a dumping ground. It was a public declaration Sparta does not nurture weakness. Think of how other cultures handled unwanted children. In Athens, exposure usually meant leaving a baby at a crossroads or outside a temple where someone might adopt it. In Rome, paterfamilias had the right to accept or reject a newborn by simply lifting or ignoring it. But Sparta made its rejection an act of the state, not the household. That shift is what makes it extraordinary and terrifying. When you imagine the apothete, don't picture a private tragedy in a back alley. Picture a system stamped with the city's seal of approval, as official as a law carved in stone. The geography of Taygetus adds a layer of drama. The mountain range dominates the Spartan horizon, jagged peaks slicing into the sky. To carry a newborn up there was to stage a ritual, a blending of nature's majesty and human severity. You can almost hear the cicadas buzzing in the summer heat, the clatter of loose rocks underfoot, the hush that falls when the bundle is set down or cast off. For the Spartans, this landscape wasn't hostile. It was part of the cleansing process, the mountain serving as judge and executioner alongside the elders. And yet, don't imagine that Sparta alone was cruel. Survivalist societies everywhere drew lines between the fit and unfit. The difference is, Sparta ritualized it, turned it into a civic identity. When foreign visitors heard of the apothete, they either gasped in horror or shook their heads in admiration. No wonder their warriors are unmatched, some said. Others muttered even barbarians would not do this. That contrast between awe and disgust has followed Sparta through history. It's worth pausing to compare with something closer to home. Consider how modern societies deal with the harsh limits of survival. We may not abandon infants on mountainsides, but debates around healthcare, genetic testing, and end-of-life decisions stir similar unease. When resources are scarce, when strength is idealized, uncomfortable questions arise. Who gets cared for, and who gets quietly set aside? You might shiver, realizing that the logic of the apothete hasn't vanished. It has just changed costumes. Now what about the mothers? For them, the pit wasn't a symbol. It was absence made permanent. A woman in Sparta could bear many children, but each time she knew, the city's hand hovered above the cradle. Did she dare hope, or did she steel herself, bracing for judgment as much as for childbirth? Plutarch doesn't record their tears, but you can almost hear them carried on the Taygetus wind. The mountain remembers what history omits. The apothete was not only about babies, it was about shaping memory. Every Spartan child who grew up knowing this story understood deep down you are alive because you were chosen. That awareness must have weighed heavily, fueling pride, but also anxiety. If you stumbled in training, if you showed weakness, you were not just failing yourself, you were betraying the chance the city gave you when it let you live. Isn't it strange how survival itself could become a lifelong burden? You've survived the inspection and dodged the shadow of Taygetus, but imagine the mothers of those who didn't. In Sparta, a woman's role wasn't just to bear children, it was to bear warriors. A mother's pride was measured not by how tenderly she rocked a cradle, but by how many strong sons she could give to the state. And yet, the cruel arithmetic of infanticide meant many mothers ended up with empty arms before they even had the chance to hear their child's first laugh. Picture the moment, a mother still weak from childbirth, watching an elder carry her baby away. She's told it's civic duty, told it's better this way, told her grief must be swallowed because Sparta comes first. But grief doesn't vanish just because a law demands it. Even the strongest Spartan woman, the kind later poets described as proud and iron-willed, must have wept in private. The silence of history hides those tears, but silence does not erase them. Spartan women had unusual freedoms compared to other Greek women. They could own property, manage estates, and train their bodies. Outsiders like Aristotle grumbled about how free they were. But even with this freedom, their power over their children's survival was practically zero. The state intervened right from the beginning. It's a paradox. Women were celebrated as mothers of warriors, yet their first maternal instinct to protect was stripped from them. What does freedom mean when you can't even decide whether your newborn lives? It's worth asking, did these women ever rebel? We don't have records of a mother snatching back her baby and running into the hills. But maybe resistance took quieter forms. A whispered prayer to Artemis, a secret hope that the elders would overlook a defect, a refusal to let bitterness harden into obedience. Sometimes rebellion isn't swords and fire, it's the refusal to forget the face of the child you lost. Modern parents might recognize something familiar here. Have you ever been told by experts what's best for your child, only to feel your heart screaming? Otherwise, pediatricians, teachers, government policies, all with good intentions, can sometimes feel like the Spartan elders of our age. Of course, they aren't deciding life or death, but the tension between authority and instinct is eternal. Do you trust the experts, or do you trust the ache in your chest? Spartan mothers never got to choose. And yet we can't forget how the system rewarded those who did give birth to strong children. Mothers were honored for producing warriors praised in song and story. A famous line attributed to Spartan women is, "With it," or "on it," the instruction to sons about their shields, meaning come back victorious or dead. It's a chilling motto, but imagine the pressure it placed on the women who spoke it. How many of them were still haunted by the cry of a child judged unfit years earlier? To encourage one son to die bravely while remembering another lost at birth must have been an unbearable contradiction. The grief of Spartan mothers also rippled through families. Sisters grew up knowing they might not have all the siblings their mother bore. Husbands may have avoided speaking about it, swallowing their own sorrow in stoic silence. And grandmothers well imagine watching your bloodline trimmed by the cold hand of civic policy. Generations carried the weight of this loss, even if they never voiced it. Later writers like to romanticize Spartan women as fierce, unflinching, almost inhuman in their loyalty to the state. But strip away the marble statue, and you find flesh and blood. You find women who loved, who lost, who smiled at their babies before Judgment Day arrived. You find resilience, yes, but also scars carved into hearts. History often tells us what Spartans did. It rarely tells us what they felt. The mothers of Sparta remind us that behind every law lies human cost. What if I told you that in Sparta, even fathers weren't truly fathers? That might sound dramatic, but the reality was sharper still. You grow up picturing a dad cradling his newborn, maybe humming a clumsy lullaby, maybe arguing over whose nose the baby inherited. In Sparta, none of that mattered. The father's instinct to protect was overridden by the state command. He wasn't just dad. He was first and foremost a Spartan citizen, sworn to the laws of Lycurgus. The philosopher Plutarch notes that Spartan fathers didn't decide their children's fate. The Council of Elders, the Gerousia, made the call. If the child was deemed unfit, a father was expected to stand silent as the bundle was carried away. Think about that. Every fiber of natural instinct must have wanted to step forward to object to plead. But training from his own childhood, the Agagi's relentless lessons in obedience, taught him that the city was more important than his private feelings. A Spartan father who rebelled risked more than punishment. He risked dishonor, and dishonor in Sparta was worse than exile. This dynamic reshaped family life. A father's pride wasn't measured by tenderness, but by how many strong sons he could contribute to the phalanx. Imagine walking through the agora with neighbors whispering, "That's the one whose boy didn't pass the test." Shame clung to him like a cloak. In a community where reputation mattered more than wealth, the loss of a child could be twisted into proof of weakness in the bloodline. That sting didn't fade quickly. Xenophon admired this cold system, praising it as the ultimate form of civic loyalty. To him, fathers who surrendered their emotions were heroes of discipline, men who put Sparta before themselves. But from another perspective, it's chilling. Can you imagine telling a modern father that his love for his child is irrelevant compared to what the city thinks? It would sound absurd. And yet, in Sparta, this was normal. Here's a comparison you might find relatable. Imagine working for a corporation that claims to be your family. You give them your time, your loyalty, your health, but when they demand something unreasonable, longer hours, less pay, you're expected to smile and obey. That's the Spartan father, only magnified 100 times. His real family was the state. His biological family was secondary. You think you belong to your household, but in truth, you're on loan to Sparta. And yet some fathers surely struggled with this role. History doesn't record their quiet conflicts, but they must have existed. Maybe one man clenched his fists behind his back nails, digging into palms as his child was judged. Maybe another looked away, unable to watch. Stoicism doesn't erase emotion, it only hides it. The cracks in the armor were always there, even if Spartan culture demanded silence about them. It's also worth noting how this structure reinforced Spartan militarism. By denying fathers full authority over their own children, the state prevented family bonds from growing too strong. A soldier couldn't hesitate on the battlefield, thinking of his son's small hands. By controlling that first bond at birth, Sparta was already training men to sever personal attachment for the sake of collective duty. Clever, yes. Humane, not so much. Even kings were not immune. The story goes that King Agesilaus, though respected as a leader, had been born with one leg shorter than the other. Some whispered that under stricter interpretations of the law, he might not have survived infancy. Yet because of his royal bloodline, he was spared. It's a telling detail, even in a society obsessed with equality of discipline. Exceptions crept in when power demanded. Doesn't that sound familiar? Rules are rigid for the powerless, flexible for the elite. So you see, the fathers of Sparta lived with a strange contradiction. They were honored as warriors, respected as citizens, but hollowed out as parents. They could sire children, yes, but they could not truly claim them until the state allowed it. To love your baby unconditionally was to break the silent contract. And in Sparta, contracts with the state were written not in ink, but in iron. You might be tempted to think the Spartans were heartless, but in their own eyes, this was reason, not cruelty. the logic was chillingly simple. A society built entirely on warfare had no room for those who could not fight. If every man must stand shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx holding the line until the last breath, then every weak body endangered not only itself, but also the man beside it. In a culture where survival depended on cohesion, the loss of one life at birth was framed as protection for many lives later. Plutarch again notes that the practice was designed to prevent the raising of ill-born children who might become a burden. The phrasing alone tells you everything. Children weren't seen as individuals, but as potential assets or liabilities. You weren't a person yet. You were a future soldier or a future drain. The calculation was cold, but it had its own logic. Imagine a modern coach cutting players from a team tryout. Only here, the cut wasn't about riding the bench. It was about riding out of life altogether. It's easy to sit back and call them monsters, but ask yourself, honestly, haven't we seen similar thinking, dressed in modern clothes? When hospitals ration care in crises, when insurance companies decide who gets treatment, when governments talk about sustainable populations, the echoes are there. We may not throw babies into ravines, but the calculus of survival versus cost hasn't disappeared. It's only been buried under layers of bureaucracy and softer language. The Spartans were not alone in this mindset either. Across the ancient world, societies practiced forms of exposure, abandonment, or selection. What set Sparta apart was the way they embraced it as state policy, not private shame. They didn't whisper about it in back alleys, they announced it on the mountainside. The dark truth wasn't the act itself, but the normalization of it, the way it was woven into their identity as naturally as their red cloaks or long hair. If you lived in Sparta, you might even convince yourself it was merciful. Better perhaps to let a child slip away quietly in infancy than to watch them suffer in a brutal world with no support for disability or chronic illness. Better to end pain before it starts. That argument can sound almost compassionate until you remember it wasn't compassion that guided the elders, it was utility. Compassion comforts the individual. Utility strengthens the state. The two were rarely aligned in Sparta. You can sense how this logic shaped not only policy, but psychology. Spartan children who survived grew up knowing they were the strong, the chosen. That pride carried with it an unspoken burden. If you faltered later, you were betraying the decision that spared you. Imagine the pressure of walking through life with the ghost of the apothete behind you whispering, "You lived, prove you deserved it." A child might not articulate it, but the weight pressed down all the same. It also explains why Spartan citizens treated infants almost like crops. A field must be weeded to produce a stronger harvest. A city must weed out its weakest shoots to stand firm against its enemies. Cold farming logic applied to human life. The metaphor itself is unsettling, but for the Spartans, it was common sense. A sickly stalk weakens the row. A sickly child weakens the phalanx. You may wince at the comparison, but they lived it without flinching. Even philosophers wrestled with this reasoning. Aristotle, though critical of some Spartan practices, agreed that regulating births and discarding the unfit was politically rational. He framed it as hygiene for the state, a kind of social medicine. But Plato, though fascinated by Sparta, pushed the idea further in his Republic, imagining selective breeding and control of reproduction to create the best citizens. You can see how the seeds of Spartan logic sprouted in later minds. Once you accept the premise that strength equals survival, the conclusions follow with frightening ease. So when you picture the apothete and the decisions made, there don't imagine random cruelty or barbaric sadism. Imagine clipboards, checklists of process as standardized as renewing your driver's license. That was the true horror, not rage, not chaos, but order. Cold, unyielding order, wrapped in the language of reason. The Spartans didn't believe they were doing something evil. They believed they were doing something necessary. And necessity, as history shows us again and again, is one of the most dangerous justifications of all. You've survived the pit you've been weighed and not found wanting. And now your real trial begins. The state that judged you worthy at birth doesn't let you rest in your mother's arms for long. By the age of 7, you're plucked from your household and funneled straight into the Agoge Sparta's infamous training program. If the inspection at birth was the first pruning, this is the furnace that tempers what remains. The Agoge wasn't a school in the way you imagine classrooms today. There were no backpacks, no colorful posters, no parents' evenings with teachers. It was more like an endless boot camp where obedience was beaten into your bones and individuality was scraped away like rust. You ate at communal messes. You slept in barracks with other boys. You learned to endure hunger, cold, and humiliation without complaint. The logic was simple. If you couldn't endure hardship as a child, you'd never endure war as an adult. Hunger was deliberate. Boys were intentionally underfed, encouraged to steal food to survive. But if you were caught stealing, the punishment was severe, not because stealing was wrong, but because being caught proved you were clumsy. Xenophon admired this strange twist, pointing out that it honed cunning. It's a bizarre lesson in ethics, isn't it? Morality bent around practicality. Don't be virtuous, be effective. Don't get caught. You can almost imagine a modern kid's shocked face if their teacher said you should sneak snacks, but only if you're clever enough not to get detention. Pain was constant too. Whippings, contests of endurance, and brutal mock fights tested how much your body could take. Plutarch tells of boys who stood silent under lashes until their skin split all to prove Spartan toughness. Some even died during these rituals, martyrs, not for a god, but for an ideal of discipline. It sounds horrifying, but in their society, it was glorious. Weakness was shameful. Silence under pain was heroic. Have you ever held back a scream when you stubbed your toe in public just to look tough? Multiply that by 1,000 and you're close to the Spartan mindset. Friendships, or something more complicated, also formed under this pressure. Older youths often mentored younger boys, shaping them into warriors. These bonds could be strict, affectionate, or sometimes intense in ways that blurred lines between duty and intimacy. To the Spartans, it was another layer of control, another way to ensure loyalty. When your life depended on the man beside you in the phalanx, emotional bonds became tools of survival. The Agag also polished skills beyond brute force. You learned songs, chants, and even witty comebacks. Spartans prided themselves on brevity of speech, those sharp one-liners that still echo in history books. "Come and take them," Leonidas famously said to the Persians. That style wasn't natural, it was drilled. You were trained to be sharp, quick, and cutting with words just as you were with a spear. And through it all, the shadow of that early inspection never left. Every bruise, every scar, every test was haunted by the thought you lived because you were strong enough. Now, you must stay strong or prove the elders wrong. It's like being hired for a job you never applied for. You can't quit with failure, punished not by a pink slip, but by disgrace, or worse. Some boys thrived in this furnace, becoming models of Spartan discipline. Others cracked, but even their cracks were absorbed into the system lessons for the rest. The agog wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to be relentless. If you faltered, you became a cautionary tale. If you endured, you became Sparta's pride. Either way, the machine kept moving. By the time you emerged at adulthood, the tender memory of your mother's arms, if you ever knew, it was buried under years of training. You weren't just a man, you were a Spartan, forged from birth to serve the collective. The inspection at the Lesh, the shadow of the apothete, had merely been the first page. The agogi wrote the rest, line by line, scar by scar. What if I told you that even the gods were drafted into the grim arithmetic? To the Spartans, infanticide wasn't just a civic policy, it was cloaked in the language of sacred duty. The elders on the Lesh weren't just men judging flesh. They were in their own minds executing the will of Olympus. And when the state invoked the gods, who in their right mind could argue Spartan religion was practical, almost brutally so. Apollo, Artemis, Zeus. They weren't distant deities tucked away in myths. They were invoked to sanctify everyday decisions, including the fate of infants. Artemis Orthia, the goddess tied to fertility and protection, was also linked to harsh rituals of endurance. Her altar became a stage where boys were whipped until blood ran offerings meant to prove devotion. In such a framework, is it any surprise that the same divine sanction stretched back to infancy? If a child was too weak, perhaps Artemis herself had spoken through that frailty. Plutarch hints that the Spartans rationalized exposure as a way of letting nature, and by extension, the gods decide. Let the earth take what it rejects was the idea. The state didn't call it murder, it called it obedience. It's a neat trick, isn't it? Wrap necessity in divine robes, and suddenly cruelty becomes piety. You might shake your head, but think about how often in history terrible acts have been justified with the phrase, God wills it. Festivals reinforced this logic. At religious gatherings, the same society that cast out infants celebrated its chosen sons with dance song and sacrifice. Priests blessed young warriors heading into the Goj, their survival framed as divine favor. Can you imagine the psychological weight to survive was not just luck, it was proof the gods wanted you alive. And if the gods wanted you alive, you'd better not waste it. That belief fused fear and faith into a single iron chain. It also kept families in line. A grieving mother might weep in private, but to challenge the state's decision was to challenge the gods themselves. Better to swallow the grief than risk impiety. Religion, in this sense, didn't soothe it, silenced. It transformed personal loss into public obedience. And yet, even in this silence, you can imagine whispered prayers at shrines, desperate bargains with Artemis or Apollo. Next time, let my child be strong. Other Greek cities used religion differently. In Athens, abandoned children were often left near temples as if to say, let the gods decide their fate. In Sparta, the gods had already spoken, and the city claimed to know their voice. It's a subtle but powerful distinction. Athens deferred to chant Sparta to order. When you step back, you see how religion completed the triangle: civic logic, military necessity, and divine sanction. Together, they created an airtight justification. Who could resist such a trio? To resist the elders was to resist Sparta. To resist Sparta was to resist the gods. The brilliance and horror of the system lay in how completely it bound belief to policy. Even centuries later, writers admired the Spartans not only for their discipline, but for how their piety intertwined with their toughness. Xenophon praised their devotion to ritual as much as their military. To him, the two were inseparable. And so the practice of infanticide wasn't an ugly exception. It was part of a seamless worldview, stitched together with spears and hymns. If you've ever wondered how people accept systems that seem unthinkable to outsiders, here's your answer. Wrap the rules in the sacred, and the unthinkable becomes unquestionable. That was the genius of Sparta, and also its shadow. Once you see how Sparta braided law war and the sacred into one rope, you start noticing similar chords elsewhere, thinner, looser, but recognizable. Other Greek cities also practiced exposure, only they outsourced the decision to private households instead of elevating it to a civic ceremony under the gaze of Artemis. In Athens, the moment of truth came when a father lifted a newborn from the ground to acknowledge it. If he didn't lift the child, the implication was clear. The baby could be exposed, often at a crossroads or near a shrine, where chance or pity might intervene. You picture a wicker basket left by a temple gate, footsteps fading, and you realize how different that feels from a state elder's verdict at the lesh. One is family crisis wrapped in hope of rescue. The other is policy written on stone. Which would you prefer if your fate were hanging by a thread? Athens framed the act as a household decision shaped by poverty scandal or fear of too many mouths. It wasn't publicly celebrated. It was privately endured, with the city quietly looking away. Adoption sometimes followed, and stories circulated of exposed children, later recognized by birthmarks and reunited with stunned parents. It's messy, it's human, and it carries a whisper of second chances, quite unlike the cold finality of a trek up Tagetus. You can almost hear an Athenian shrug. We'll let fortune decide. Sparta would have raised an eyebrow and said, fortune is a poor bureaucrat. Rome, ever fond of rules and rituals, made the family gatekeeper even more explicit. Under the vast umbrella of patria potestas, a father could accept or reject a newborn, and the gesture of picking the child up taller liberum signaled recognition. Refuse to lift, and the baby could be exposed. The Romans dressed this in the language of household order, not communal sacrifice, but the power remained stark. The legend of Romulus and Remus set adrift on the Tiber, and miraculously saved by a she-wolf, reads like a national myth built from the bones of an all-too-common practice. Isn't it telling that even Rome's origin story begins with rejected infants who survive because fate and a very patient wolf intervenes? Yet Roman practice, unlike Sparta's, left cracks. Where compassion could seep in, neighbors might intervene. Slaves or poor families might raise a foundling. Later, the empire's changing moral climate, nudged by philosophical debates, and eventually Christian bishops pressed for reforms. Emperors issued edicts that discouraged exposure, allowed desperate parents to sell children rather than abandon them, and supported foundling care. The machine kept turning, but the gears softened. You can't picture a Spartan decree saying sell rather than expose without the whole system groaning in protest. Sparta chose clarity over compromise. Rome fumbled toward compromise and called it civilization. Elsewhere in the Greek world, you find variations on the theme. In Thebes and Corinth, exposure appeared as private tragedy, not public ritual. In Crete law, codes obsessed over inheritance and legitimacy skirting the harsh specifics, but revealing a culture preoccupied with fit heirs. Philosophers added their own spice. Plato, dazzled by Spartan discipline, imagined selective breeding and communal child-rearing in his ideal city, merciless in theory if tidier on paper. Aristotle, with his cool political thermometer, suggested regulating births and culling the unfit as if he were pruning a civic garden. You recognize the tune by now. When survival and order are the melody, mercy becomes the background hum. Move farther afield, and the pattern keeps repeating, but the reasons shift with the landscape. In small, resource-tight communities, think hard winters, unpredictable harvests, limited calories, the stark calculus sometimes tilted toward exposure during famines or crises. That doesn't excuse it. It explains how fear and scarcity push human beings to edges they'd rather never see. Would you judge a storm-battered village by the same standards as a wealthy port with granaries? It's the kind of uncomfortable question that makes you rub your temples at 2 a.m. and stare at the ceiling. Carthage adds a thorny case that scholars still argue about memorial grounds containing urns with the cremated remains of infants and small children, which some interpret as a ritual of offering others as a graveyard of high infant mortality dressed in religious rites. Whatever the final verdict, you sense the same pressure, a city trying to wrap loss in ceremony to shape grief into purpose. Sparta would nod at the impulse to sanctify necessity, even if the details diverged. When survival sits in the judge's chair, ritual often plays bailiff. If you're looking for a clean moral map, antiquity offers you. Athens relied on private decisions with a side door for rescue. Rome legalized paternal choice, but slowly carved out escape valves. Various polis looked the other way, while families solved problems in the shadows. Philosophers dreamed systems where the best citizens replaced the merely human. Only Sparta stood in the town square and declared, with mountain air in its lungs, the city decides. That's the difference you keep circling back to, not that others were kinder, but that Sparta was prouder, more theatrical, more official about the cut. Now place yourself amid these options. If you were an anxious parent in Athens, you might slip to a temple at night and hope a kindly couple would find the basket. In Rome, you might argue your case with relatives, appeal to a patron, or later knock on a bishop's door. In Sparta, you would not argue. You would stand very still while the Gerousia inspected the swaddled bundle and pronounced a verdict that felt less like parenthood and more like politics. Which world would you choose if all three offered you both sorrow and possibility? You also start noticing the language each society uses to make itself feel better. Fortune will decide, say, Athenians outsourcing guilt to luck. Paternal authority, say Romans, wrapping power in the toga of tradition. The city's law, say Spartans, turning grief into duty. Even the most sophisticated cultures lean on phrases that translate pain into policy. And people go along because phrases are soft, softer than cliffs, softer than courts, softer than the sound a basket makes when you set it down and walk away. Across all these echoes, one truth keeps returning to your door, like an insistent knock. Systems reflect what they fear. Athens feared disorder in the oikos and chose privacy with plausible rescue. Rome feared a household without hierarchy and chose a father with a gavel. Sparta feared weakness contaminating the line and chose a mountain. When you compare them side by side, you don't get a tidy scale from bad to worst. You get a gallery of choices made under pressure, each framed by a culture's favorite justifications and blind spots. Does that make you a little more patient with the past or a little more wary of the words we use today when we dress necessity in noble clothes? And somewhere, because history has a mischievous sense of timing, you recall the boys bleeding for Artemis, Orthia, the elders squinting in the Lesh, the Athenian father hesitating at the threshold, the Roman patron stroking his beard while a young couple pleads. Different cities, different scripts, same unease. You've seen the outline often enough now to trace it with your eyes closed. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the chorus. Not approval, not outrage, but the shuffling, awkward music of people trying to live with decisions they can't quite look in the face. You leave the agora of old comparisons and step into the fluorescent glow of the present. And the uncomfortable thing is how much of Sparta's logic still hums under modern wallpaper. We don't march babies toward a ravine, but we do weigh lives with clipboards, spreadsheets, and phrases that make hard choices sound tidy. And if you tilt your head, you can hear the same rhythm: strength, first cost, second compassion. If there's room, you watch hospitals practice triage when disasters strike color-coded tags and calm voices deciding who gets the next bed. And in that brisk efficiency, you recognize the Spartan admiration for order. Only now it wears scrubs instead of bronze. No one means harm. Everyone is trying to save as many as possible. But the math never stops whispering that some bodies are easier to rescue than others. And you find yourself wondering, have you ever been comforted by the word criteria when what you really wanted was a miracle? You think about prenatal screening and how a grainy ultrasound can become a crossroads, parents staring at charts while a specialist outlines risks, outcomes, and support. And the room turns into a modern lesh with softer chairs. The choice today is private rather than public, wrapped in counseling and options. Yet the pressure to align with best outcomes can lean hard on shoulders already shaking. And the question that keeps floating up is whether best means cheapest, easiest, or truly most humane, which are not always the same things. You scroll